'Tis live. Awesome. So live now tweet time, which I already had prepared because I'm on top of things. There we go. Now, back to the show notes. Thanks for joining us once again. I'm Sammy K. Powers, and this is the PHP Roundtable. This is a podcast of developers discussing things that PHP nerds care about. And as always, you can check out phproundtable.com and submit a little form on there with ideas that you have about something that you want to share on PHP Roundtable or something that you would like to see on PHP Roundtable. I always love ideas. And the ultimate goal of this little podcast is to learn a little something from each other. So after years of resisting, I finally drank the Docker Kool-Aid for my everyday client work. It took me a long time. Lots of people were shouting at me that I should use Docker, and I was like, yeah, I'm sure it's great, but I finally did it. And it's been about a couple months now that I've actually transitioned over, and I wanted to have a follow-up episode to kind of talk about my experiences with that. So this is our follow-up episode. The first one we had about Docker was episode 48, which we're bringing on all the familiar faces plus a new one for this episode, which is really cool. So today we talk about my transition from Vagrant to Docker and some of the bumps I hit along the way. So without further ado, let's meet our panel. And as always, in no particular order, we have Phillip Shipley, as in shipping containers, wink. He's a secret member of the Containerati, developer / breaker of things, husband, father, and homebrewer. And his one-liner intro was copy-pasted from his Twitter bio. Welcome, Phillip.
Thanks for having me again. It's good to be back.
Absolutely. We also have a new face for this episode, Chris Fidao. He's the guy behind Servers for Hackers and the Shipping Docker screencast series. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, thanks.
Absolutely. And we have another Chris Tankersley, Dragonman Tank on Twitter. He's a PHP jack of all trades and author of Docker for Developers. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Sammy.
Since we have two Chris's, I'm going to call Dragonman Tank on Twitter, either Dragonman Tank on Twitter or Tankersley, and Chris Fidao, Chris. Maybe we won't get that too confused, hopefully.
Right. We'll see.
Yes.
You can call me Fideloper. That's cool.
Oh, that's a nice one. I like that. Oh, yes. I forgot to mention, if you're on Twitter, you can always ping PHP Roundtable. I've got the notifications pulled up here, and we'll try to get your witty comment and or question answered. There's already Rick on Twitter is asking, how do I get my hands on a sticker? Whew. Well, maybe if you ask nicely, I might send you one. We've got some brand new ones. Dragonman Tank on Twitter, Tankersley. I tried to give him one of my stickers several times, but they're really big. And he's like, don't give me that. It's too big.
They take up like the entire back of a laptop. You can't buy stickers that large.
It's true. But I've almost run out of those. So I've got brand new little ones that I'm sending out for the developer shout outs. So Rick, hit me up and I'll try to get your address and send you one. Okay, so I started down this Docker path by first having an episode about it and asking several of you about like your experiences and like how to get set up with Docker. And I still was kind of a little apprehensive. And it wasn't until I started a talk about Xdebug and debugging, step debugging. And I wanted to show an example of how to do that with a Docker container setup. And at the time, I had never used Docker for anything. So Chris Fidao had a tutorial on how to get set up with Nginx and all this kind of things. And I kind of went through that tutorial and got the Docker file set up. And I got it working within like 30 minutes. And I was like, wow, that's really cool.
I thought you were going to say, and nothing worked and everything was terrible.
No, I mean, that's what you would expect, right? But it wasn't. It was great. And it took me about another month or two before I finally decided, okay, I'm going to try this on a real client project. So when I did that, it took me about an hour, I think, of configuration to get it set up the way I wanted to. But it was like a painless experience. And I wasn't running Vagrant because I typically have a Vagrant VM that's basically running all the things, all of my projects. And it's really a pain in the butt because some of my projects are legacy applications that don't work really well on PHP 7.1 or the latest version of PHP. And I was having trouble with some of those, getting them upgraded. So it was just like versions and configuration was always had to be set up the same way. So I started doing it with Docker. And now every time I set up a project, it takes me like 30 minutes and I got it set up. Now, here's my thing. I have a README that I always update, and I basically copy and paste the documentation that I've set up for myself about running Docker. So one of the things that's kind of catches me is that like when I'm running a container, I've got a maybe we should throw this out. It makes more sense for me to think about it with using Docker Compose versus Docker. Mm-hmm. So can any of you explain to me why I might approach Docker first with Docker Compose versus Docker? Why does that make more sense to me? Does it make sense to either of you more?
Yeah. Like Docker is good, but I mean, you have to use Docker to figure out how Docker works. And then you use Docker Compose because you know how Docker works, and Docker Compose does a lot of that work for you. So for me, the key point is knowing what the hell is going on with Docker first. Otherwise, you're just jumping into something and something's going to break and you're going to have no idea like what's going on because you don't have that underlying knowledge of what Compose is doing for you. But otherwise, if you know that, if you're at that point, definitely use Docker Compose because everything else is a complete pain.
Yeah, I like how
Docker Compose allows you to like keep all that stuff in a text file where you can just plop it in a text file, Docker Compose up, and everything builds itself and links itself. Or if you do everything with just Docker commands, you have to manually put stuff together, remember all the commands, remember all the, where am I mounting stuff, all of that stuff where Docker Compose just keeps track of all of it for you, which is, to Chris's point, you have to know what Docker's doing under the hood because it's taking care of all of those Docker commands for you, basically. But once you get past that hurdle of what does Docker do, Docker Compose is probably the next kind of magical step that most people hit on, and that's much easier than running it by hand all the time.
Yeah, otherwise it's a really long command that I have to enter. And that's one thing that was kind of scared me away from using it at the beginning, was just kind of seeing the commands you have to run in order to get a container built and run. So I guess I at fundamental standpoint, at minimum, I kind of need a Docker file, just called Docker file, capital D, with no extension. And then you list like what container you're basically starting with, like your base container, and then you get like some commands that set up your configuration or install things for you. Now, when I run the Docker command, you have like all these flags like -IT for, I guess, interactive TTY, and there's a lot of times you use the -RM or --RM to remove the container after it's done, which that's one thing that I don't really understand about Docker is like, why do we like set it up and then immediately remove it after we're done with the command?
Well, I think it depends what you're doing. So if you start up generally I'll have an Apache container and a MySQL container and a couple other containers that just sit there that make my application work. Those I always want to stay around. So I would never --RM those. But I do a lot of one-off commands like Composer, my unit tests, stuff like that, where --RM says, use this container for something real quick, but I'm never going to keep this around. Like, I don't care if it persists, like I do my database container or my Apache container or stuff like that. So --RM is really nice for commandish type things or like one-off type stuff instead of long-running processes.
Yeah, I'll also do that a lot when I'm building my initial Docker file and I want to test a step or figure out why it didn't work or what's going on. I can just, exec into a base container or run the base container interactive and have it delete itself afterwards, but run the commands manually and directly until I see that they're working how I want them to, and then I can go update my Docker file to fix issues there. And then that way it's a built-in garbage collection. I don't need that image anymore. I'm not going to use it for anything else. Let it get cleaned up and thrown away, so I don't get confused later or don't clutter up the system later.
Yeah, that built-in garbage collection is nice because when you run a container and then it finishes and the container stops running, it still exists. It's just not running. So if you never clean out those containers, then you have this list of unrunning, unused containers just hanging around in your system. So the --RM flag is really nice because it removes it when it's done. Otherwise, you might forget about it, and then you have this big list of unused containers just hanging around, mucking up your file system.
Taking up precious hard drive space on my laptop.
Yeah, exactly.
So if I use the -RM, do I have to build it again, or is that a separate thing?
No, because building it is building an image, and the image is the thing your container uses to run a new container from. So your image is like just a state, I guess. And you run containers off of that. So you can make a container, you can destroy a container, and stop and remove a container. That doesn't, and that's meant to be ephemeral. Those things, for the most part, it's the image that matters, and that's what you build with the Docker file.
Cool.
I can't remember if it was Phil in our last episode. A good way to think about it is the image is like the class in PHP, where the container is the object. So you could build tons of objects from a single class, but your class or your image kind of stays all there in the background, waiting to be turned into something that actually runs.
Yeah, and I think one kind of caveat or the thing that can get you when you don't remember how the whole build and run thing works is that if in your Docker file is when you're copying certain things into the image and then you're running it and something doesn't work, so you change those files and you delete your container and then you run it again and you can't figure out why it's still not working, you may need to go back and rebuild your image because it never copied those files in. And that's where the whole Docker Compose shortcuts and quickness for getting volumes set up so that you can have your files synced inside the container are really helpful to reduce how often you really need to rebuild them during development and testing.
Yeah, so speaking of Docker Compose, I've been using that. I have I guess it's Docker Compose.yaml. Is that the config file, right?
Mhm.
And you basically set up all the flags that you would typically run in a Docker command. So instead of typing in Docker and then this giant 3,000 mile long command, you can just say Docker Compose up, or no, Docker Compose start. Is that right?
No, up is right.
Up. Okay. Yeah. Like Vagrant up, right? And that does all the things. But of course, you want to do Docker Compose build first, right? To build the actual image.
Yeah, I mean, it'll build for you if it needs to.
Oh, nice. So I don't even have to do the build step?
Nope.
That's cool.
Right.
Now, sometimes if you change stuff and you do Docker Compose up, it doesn't notice, and you might have to do a Docker Compose build. But
Yeah.
most of the time, it figures out. Especially if you're starting a brand new project, it'll go through and build everything for you.
Cool. Nice. Yeah. So if I make a change to a config file, say like I have an Nginx file that I've got, and in the Docker file, I specify that it should be copied into the image. Does it copy into the image or the container?
It gets copied into the image. If you're doing a copy or an add statement in the Docker file, that happens at build time. You can do things like volumes where you can actually move a file in kind of at runtime, but those are considered volumes as opposed to add or copies.
Gotcha. Yeah. So if I do that, if I make a change to like say Nginx config file, and then I do a Docker Compose, say it's not running, and then I already built it, I already ran it, and then I shut it down, and I'm running it again, or then I make a change and I run it again without building it. It doesn't recognize that change. I have to build it first.
Right, because it's mostly watching for Docker file and Docker Compose changes. It doesn't really watch for file changes in your actual application. So if you change configuration files, then you need to do a build.
Right. Cool. Well, so when I used Docker Compose, it was really nice to do Docker Compose up with the YAML file, and everything was working. And in my documentation, I just had Docker Compose stop, which stops the containers. But after I was getting comfortable with that for a while, I thought, well, you know what? I don't need to copy and paste from the documentation anymore. I'll just try to go by memory. So one day I was kind of working on a project, and it was just a local project. So I had like a local database running with MySQL that I wasn't actually going to publish. It was just literally just for something I was working on locally to keep track of things in my database. And I didn't look at my documentation. I was like, let me see if I can go by memory. Docker Compose down, because that's the opposite of up. So it did the same thing. It stopped the container, but it also deleted the freaking container, which I wasn't expecting. And I didn't have a separate mount for my databases. So it went ahead and just deleted all my databases while I was in there, which was incredibly frustrating. Which is one of the frustrating things about Vagrant, is that the opposite of Vagrant up is not Vagrant down, it's Vagrant halt, which it's just like, why can't we just make this semantically make sense? But anyway, I guess that in the...
Are you using the default MySQL image, like the official one?
Uh-huh.
So you didn't actually lose that data. You just thought you did.
Oh, really?
Were you going to say that? So if you look at the Docker file of a lot of those official containers, the official images, especially the ones that have anything to do with state, right? Like Redis or a cache or a database, Postgre, MySQL, whatever. A lot of them define a volume. They have the volume thing inside of the Docker file, and they give a path. That tells Docker to make a volume, which is like its own special construct in Docker. And that volume is that volume is essentially a mount. You don't have to define it at runtime. You don't just say, -v, share this directory to this directory. It'll create that by itself kind of in the background. And it's mounted, right? Apparently, but the files end up on your disk in reality. So if you did like Docker volume ls to list the volumes, I think you could reattach that volume to your new container when you spun it back up. If you didn't do that, Docker Compose should, I mean, it does for me, depending on the version, maybe, I don't know. It it re-adds that volume back into your container that's running. So like in my setup, I have the exact same thing. I don't tell it to mount any volumes for MySQL. I just know it's making a volume. And when I do Docker Compose down and back up, my data is still back there. So I don't know if you had it configured like a little bit differently, or if that was an older version before they did that stuff.
Yeah, and I think as it comes to the semantics of whether you're using up and down in the Docker world, I think the way you want to think of it is up and down are like bringing an environment up and bringing an environment down. It's not because it also has the commands for start and stop. So if you want to start services from existing containers, you Docker Compose start versus Docker Compose stop, which just stops the services but doesn't remove them. So Docker Compose up will create containers and start them. Docker Compose down will stop them and remove them. But the Docker Compose start just starts, stop just stops. So
nice.
It's definitely not going to match up the same with all the other vendor products, but up and down is like the full environment and stack being brought up and down.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you're just starting off with Docker, make sure you know the differences between those, because it will bite you in the butt like it did me. And in order for me to fix this, I'll have to look, Chris Fidao, on how like if I can find the volume that was automatically mounted for me. But what I ended up doing was just going into the Docker Compose YAML file and specifying a mount for var/MySQL or wherever the databases are stored, and I just mounted them to inside the project. We should probably talk about the structure. Like inside my project, I have a folder called Docker, and basically putting all the config files, even the Docker file in there. The only thing that lives outside of that folder is the Docker Compose YAML file, so that I can run the Docker Compose from the root of the project directory, because that's usually where I'm in my terminal doing git commands and all that kind of stuff. And then I have my Docker file in there. I have my Nginx config file in there. I've got like, whatever other configuration files I need. But I also have mount points, the mount point for specifically the database, like I just have a folder called MySQL or something, and I just throw the database mount in there. And that seems to be working pretty well for me. I have a git ignore, so it doesn't actually get committed, but it keeps the folder there, so that when you pull in so somebody else can pull in the project and they'll just have an empty MySQL folder, but once they start the container, it'll build it and create an empty database for them. Is that a pretty good setup? Does that sound about right? Or am I doing it a way that's not as efficient as it could be?
You're using Docker on Mac?
I am.
I think that might be slower, because that's going to mount all the way through to your host file system, your Mac file system, versus go ahead.
I would say one thing you can do now with newer versions of Docker Compose, it wasn't in version 1, but version 2 and all the versions of 3, you can specify volumes, what they call named volumes now. And you can make a volume that's mountable across multiple containers in any way you want. And you could do a volume section in Docker Compose and say, I've got a MySQL data volume. And, most of the time you're just going to do local probably as the type. And then you can mount that named volume in any other container you want. And that's persistent outside of the actual containers itself too. So that's usually the way I do it. It's just a volume section in Compose.
That's what I was trying to say before. I didn't say it as well. I forgot to mention that you have to define it in the Docker Compose file as well. You have to just say, I want a named volume. And then it just keeps that data around. So when you go Docker Compose up and Docker Compose down, the next time you restart your containers and do up again, you'll still have all that data.
Yep.
So if I remove the container though, it'll and then remake it.
Right.
It'll still work?
Yeah, because the data, the varlib MySQL folder doesn't live inside the container only. It's in that volume, which is actually on your file system.
So the image, right?
No, not the image. It's actually on your file system, because it's like a mount. It's like a mount, but you don't have to define it manually. It's essentially that.
So it's in a magical place. That's not necessarily in the project.
Docker on Mac, it's in a magical place. That's like especially true because it's inside of like the VM that Docker runs inside. It's not actually on your Mac file system directly.
Gotcha.
So like if you use it on Linux, it's a lot more obvious. But if you run on Mac, like a lot of us do, then it's kind of hidden.
Okay, now I kind of want to talk about this a little bit, because is it true that if you're trying to access your files directly on your Mac, specifically on a Mac environment, it's slower doing it through Docker?
Yep.
So what's up with that?
So what happens is in Windows and Mac, if you're doing Linux containers, they boot up inside of a VM because Docker actually runs underneath the host operating system's kernel. It's not an actual virtual machine in and of itself, but Mac OS isn't Linux and Windows isn't Linux. So it bootstraps itself inside of a Linux virtual machine. And then if you need to get to stuff on your host machine, it's kind of like doing the VirtualBox VBMFS mounts, where you're saying, take my host machine and put it inside of a virtual machine. It's doing the same thing. The issue tends to be on OS X. The layer that their virtualization system, Xhive, uses is really, really slow. And I think that's not an issue with Docker. That's an issue with Xhive, the virtualization stuff. So it's unfair to blame Docker for it. I think Apple is working with Docker to speed that up. Cool. But it's that intermediate layer where you're transitioning from the host to inside that virtual machine. I have not noticed it as much on Windows. And then if you're using Windows containers, they actually run in Windows like a native app. So those are completely different. But all your Linux stuff, it's because of that extra layer there in between you and the virtualized Linux area.
All right. So named volumes are the way to go because it'll avoid that problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Great. So that's good to know. I had a screencast my first screencast ever that I did, and I did it on writing tests for PHP source. And for the most part, with Docker stuff, I haven't noticed like any slow things going on between accessing the native file system in Mac OS until I tried to run 15,000 tests through runtests.php. And then it's very noticeable that how much slower it is to access it through Docker.
Yeah, I notice it a lot with Drupal work, and especially Drupal 8 and Symfony, because there's a lot of I/O. I/O heavy traffic is where you see that, like my Zen framework and like my day-to-day stuff, which is using a homegrown framework. I don't notice it because there's not that much I/O between stuff. It's that really read heavy stuff that you really see it slow down.
Right. But I mean, that's like such a small trade-off for the speed that you just to get up and running with Docker. It's just really cool. I you know, so. Yeah, it's I've been hearing it from all y'all about singing the praises of Docker, and to some, I guess to some extent, us as web developers, we hear, like, especially from like say the JavaScript world, there's like always the latest and greatest framework out there. I mean, and that's true in PHP too, but not as much as like JavaScript. So things outside of PHP community is always like the latest and greatest thing. And so I think Docker, I've just been really relenting or resisting kind of converting, because I'm just like, oh, it's a fad, maybe it'll fade out. But I'm thinking that it's going to stick around for a little while. Right?
I hope so. I wrote a book about it. No, I mean, it has gotten things much easier. I have spent the last 2 days trying to get a Vagrant box to work, compared to our Docker stuff, which I wrote on and off, and I probably spent maybe an hour and a half building it for work. But I spent 2 days trying to get Vagrant boxes to work for our designer who doesn't run Docker or anything like that. So it is much easier to deal with than Vagrant is nowadays.
Absolutely.
And it sure has improved. I was thinking earlier today and yesterday about this recording coming up, trying to think, okay, what's new and different and going on? What are the tips and tricks I have for Docker now? And realizing that, last time we did this, from then to now, the product is stabilized so much that I don't even think about Docker anymore. It's like it's not a present thought anymore. It's just such an ingrained part of our workflow and our process that we just run with it. Things are working, and it hasn't been a problem or an issue in a long time. And we've been using Docker for probably close to 3 years now. And at the beginning, we struggled through a lot of various things, but Docker for Windows, Docker for Mac, things like that, it's just getting better and better.
A lot of the rough edges have been shaved off from what there was even just a year ago.
That's awesome.
Especially with a lot of the tooling outside of Docker, the Docker engine. Just stuff has gotten so much smoother to work with and be able to use across multiple platforms.
So maybe it's good I waited then, so all the rough edges could be ironed out, and then let other people deal with it and write the books, and then I can stand on the shoulders of giants. So one thing that really occurred to me when I was getting these Docker container set up so quickly is like, man, it'd be so cool if I could just do this for production. Get an EC2 instance on AWS started by just running a Docker command. But then it also occurred to me that, wait a minute, I don't necessarily want to run my Docker compose.yaml or my Docker file on production, because I've got things like xdebug installed, or maybe I'm using certain debug flags in there that I just don't want to have in production. Help me cross this bridge, because I really want to somehow use Docker in production. I want an EC2 instance run with a single command. Is that possible?
Well, that is a separate question.
Okay.
Back to the first one, which is designing your Docker file. for production readiness. And I think the key is thinking about your Docker image as being portable for any environment. And so what you want to ensure that you're doing with it is building it for production, and then in your development environment, plugging in things as needed for development. So to give you an example, when I'm building my Docker file, I'm only installing the packages I need for production. And then when I run, I copy my application source into the image, so it exists inside the image. And then I'm running running Composer with the no dev flag. I don't want any dev dependencies being installed. This is a production image. And then that's pretty much it. And then what I'll do in a local development is I'll use a volume to mount my local source on top of that application folder, so that I have real-time editability to edit my source while it's running. And then also, I'll have like a run.sh script in my image that gets copied into the Docker file, and it does some basic initialization, like setting up my RSys log for sending my logs out to an external service, and then starting Apache in the foreground. But I'll have a different run sh script for like a run dev or run s version that I can specify in the Docker Compose file locally, that can do further things like install xdebug and then start Apache, or do things like that. So those dev dependencies only exist in the runtime container of the environment where I need them, but they do not exist in production. And then also the image has all of my source with all of the Composer dependencies with everything it needs, so that I have a static binary that I'm deploying to production that has everything I need to run out there. And by doing that, I can roll back to a previous version, and that includes all my Composer dependencies, my different version of source and everything. But I also don't have any of my dev Composer dependencies. Like I used to throw phpMyAdmin in as a dev dependency in Composer, so that I would just have it when I was running locally, but I don't want that in production. So that way it never goes out there, and I don't have xdebug built in to my image that's going to potentially go to production either. So I think you got to design your file, your Docker file, your image for production, and then adapt it for development using volumes and different shell scripts or something that get run inside that environment to do other initialization factors.
Yeah, and there's cool things you can do too now, like docker-compose.yaml is the main one. You can actually stack multiple Docker Compose files on top of each other. Oh, cool. So a lot of times I will have docker-compose.yaml will be the production one, and then I'll have docker-compose.dev.yaml. And you can specify multiple ones on the command line, and it will take the stuff in dev and merge it into the first one, and then it like builds it and compiles it. So then I'll have like in production, we don't virtualize database servers. So there's no MySQL stuff in the Docker Compose, but I'll have that in my dev environment. And I'll do a little bit extra stuff, like I might point at a dev Docker file. One thing that I don't think is finished quite yet is multi-stage builds. So you can have a single Docker file that actually builds multiple containers or multiple images. And you can say build this production one, then from that, if I'm doing dev, build this dev one, which I don't think it's considered stable yet, but that's up and coming. But I'll do that. I'll have my production Docker Compose, and then I'll have a dev one, which I'll overlay on top of that. And I think it's Docker Compose -F. You can specify multiple ones.
Nice.
Yeah. And you can even do extension. So you can use the extend keyword inside of Docker Compose, and it'll extend another file. And then you can add on changes to your other Docker Compose YAML file. Cool. And I do a very similar thing to Phillip, where I have a startup script, just a shell script that actually boots up the process. So I don't know if it's too in the weeds, but you can define an entry point. And you guys are probably thinking, yep, he's getting in the weeds. Like Chris. So, but the entry point script is going to be always run no matter how you start the container. But then you can pass it stuff. So there's the entry point thing, directive, I'll call it. And then there's a command directive. And the command directive is, if you don't have an entry point, the command directive is what's run by default. And the command directive is something you can override when you start up your container. So you can say, don't use what I set in my Docker file as a command. You can say, run this command instead. But your entry point, if you define it, is always going to be run. So one thing that people do is define an entry point script, and it can do some setup and then just kind of act as a pass-through. So it can say, do some setup, and then whatever you said the command was, run that also. like at the end of it, which is just, some fancy bash stuff where it just passes in command stuff. So I have my entry point script. I actually install xdebug no matter what the environment is. And this is the same way to get to the same point. But and then for me, I just say if it's production, disable that PHP module. Otherwise, keep it enabled. And then I try to get like the host server, the host computer's IP address, so it has the correct IP address to send xdebug info to. And what else have I done? I've set different headers and Nginx depending on if it's production and stuff like that. So you can have that startup script do a lot of that upfront work. And decide what environment you're in, and then adjust stuff inside that container based on that, which is pretty neat. That's
awesome. Yeah, I love that idea. So say I've got my separate environment set up and configured properly with Docker Compose and everything, and I've got one specifically set up for development, one for production. I've got it all ironed out. Take me through the steps of, I just set up an EC2 instance, got a fresh install of Ubuntu, or I just set up a DigitalOcean instance with Ubuntu on it. I'm in Ubuntu. I don't care about any other distro, just Ubuntu. And I want to get all my project on that thing ready to go, where I can just visit my domain name and I can see my homepage with some default database installed. Is it easy?
Okay, so many things. All right, how many of you guys in production use Docker for state, like database and Redis? Do you guys do any of that?
No, I refuse to.
No, me too. So like, there's your first thing. Like, Docker is great for your stateless part of your application. So your code and your code, period. Full stop.
Yeah, pretty much your code.
And then the other stuff, like your database and all that stuff, is really great to get pushed out to other services. So if you're on Amazon, if you want to use RDS, or if you're using Redis, you can use the Redis service. Or another thing I've done is that if you're on like a single server thing, like so many of us are, I'll put my SQL and Redis directly on the server, and just my code in like Nginx is run on the container. Because the benefit of Docker is that you get to build your production image, and it has the code inside of it, and you can even tag it with like a commit SHA, so you have an image per commit of your code, so you can roll back and go forward and all that. And then that makes deployment really nice, because you just kind of like stop your old container and start your new container. Or if you're using something like Docker Swarm, you tell it to update the service, and it can do rolling deployments and fancier stuff. But the key point there is to keep it as simple as possible in production, and that usually means keeping your state, database and cache and all that stuff not in a container, and then keeping your applications in a container, so you can do, you can concentrate on the problems of deployment and what deployment means in Docker, instead of worrying about like, if you stop a container, did you just accidentally delete your database or anything like that?
Right.
Yeah. So like the dead simple deployment, and I'll do this for like really tiny stuff, and Phil's probably gonna just shake his head and say you shouldn't do this. What I would say, if you just want to try it out real super quick, build your Docker Compose, do all that, have your production Docker Compose file, use Docker Machine to create your new machine. So Docker Machine works for AWS, works for DigitalOcean, and that'll build a machine, install Docker, and allow you to easily communicate with it. Then what you can do is connect to that Docker Machine instance, and as long as you push your images up somewhere public, to some sort of public registry, like you pay for Docker Hub and use their private registry, but it's public, it's accessible on the internet somewhere. You can push your images up to Docker Hub, and it's super duper cheap. And then you can do Docker Compose up against the Docker Machine, and it will actually pull your images down, start it all up, and do all that kind of magic. And then whenever you want to do a deploy, you rebuild your Docker container, push it up, do Docker Compose up, I think -- pull, and it will pull the new versions down. And that's like the super bare bones, simple thing. You're not getting any redundancy. You're not getting the advantages of Swarm. But that's the super quick, dirty way of pushing it up. If you want it to be multi-host and have redundancy built in and scaling, then you probably want to look at Swarm. But that's the super easy way that I'll do for, like, I'll skeleton up like real basic static sites and push them out that way. Stuff that's not going to persist forever. But that's the super simple way that I've done it.
Docker create.
So there's Docker Machine. So that's one tool you'll look at. And then you can use Docker Compose against a remote machine that's built with Docker Machine.
Okay, so Docker Machine is the
Docker
command?
Machine yeah.
Docker Machine will create a remote machine for you. So it'll go to DigitalOcean through their API and build an Ubuntu box for you.
Oh, so you don't even have to set that up initially. Yeah. So you would basically, if I have AWS, for example, it'll create a new instance with me for me and do all the magical.
Yeah. And it'll even install Docker for you and everything, and set up SSH keys to talk remotely and get into it, and all sorts of neat stuff.
Crazy.
The Docker command, the command line, is just a client talking to the Docker service. So Docker Machine points that Docker client to your remote server instead of your local computer. So on your local Mac, you're still running Docker up, whatever, Docker Compose up. And instead of running against your local machine, it's running against that remote machine that you just created. So it's just like, it feels just like you're running it locally, but it's not. It's running against that remote machine. So it's pretty nice. It's a smooth, pretty smooth use case.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
so
it turns out under the hood, Docker is actually just a HTTP API.
Oh, cool.
The Docker command is literally just an API client.
Nice. If I have a client that already set up a DigitalOcean instance for me, they're like, here's an Ubuntu instance. We set up your SSH keys and all that stuff. Here's the SSH to log in. And it's just a bare instance. Can I still get that one set up with Docker Machine?
You wouldn't set it up with Docker Machine. You can do kind of the same thing manually by installing Docker and then setting up the SSL certificates back and forth. If you have a box remotely set up like that, it might be easier just to install the Docker client and just do Docker Compose on that remote machine.
I often just log in and run Docker right in the machine.
Cool. Sweet. Well, as far as deployment, if I'm not going through some sort of CI, continuous integration service, like Travis or something, to deploy updates to the production server, I like to set up a bare Git repo on the remote server, and then just do like git push production master, push the master branch to production, which I see Tankersley smiling on this one. But if I'm doing that,
I can't say anything. That's how Sculpin is set up. So.
Okay. But if I have like a simple setup like that, Docker, I wouldn't do that if I had Docker set up on production, or allowing Docker to set that up on production, because I want it to actually push the container up, not necessarily just the bare repo, right?
You want to push the image somewhere that's accessible. So all of the images live in some sort of thing called a repository that can either be locally on your machine, which if you just do a Docker build, it's putting it like in your little tiny local repository. That can be a public one like Docker Hub, which has ones that you can get for free, the open source ones, or they have a paid version so that you can only get to ones that are yours, or you can set up your own private registry. So you want to push those images to some sort of registry. I usually, if you're starting out, I recommend Docker Hub. It's super cheap, built in, and works with Docker Hub. If you're doing a lot of stuff on premises or on EC2, sometimes a private registry is good, or Amazon does have their own private registry that you can use. But you'll want to build the image and push that up somewhere. And like Phil said, I recommend, I'm on him with this, you build that image to be the whole thing, your application and everything's in there, and you'll push that whole big blob up. Those images might be kind of big, but those are your production ready images. And then on your Docker server, you'll pull those down and start containers based off of those images that you pull down.
I think as it comes to what I would start considering it when it becomes a more production environment is the orchestration that ensures your service stays online and provides the means for deployment. If you're doing the bare bones Docker Compose up and you're running your app and you've got a single container there for it and you want to deploy a new instance, you basically need to stop your container and restart it and have it, or pull, do a Docker pull to fetch the latest version of the image, and then restart your image or restart the container, or kill the current one and launch a new one to get that new version of the image. And I think that's where, from a production readiness, or calling it production grade, having the level of orchestration that would say, well, if this container goes down, I need to replace it and make sure it's back online and that I have as many instances running as I'm supposed to. And so using like Docker Swarm for that would be, that would be Docker Swarm, I guess, would be the native mechanism for orchestration of services. And then it has built-in capabilities where you're going to say, well, now I want to run version 3 and I was running 2, and it'll go figure that out and roll up and spin up version 3 and spin down version 2 and stuff like that. But We're using Amazon's ECS in production for the stuff we do, and that's essentially Amazon's orchestration or their version of Swarm running on top of EC2. And so it has that capability as well, where we'll say, I want this many versions running, and if any of them die, it replaces them automatically, so it keeps them going. And if I want to release a new version, I can call their API saying, run this new version, and it will do the rolling release for me and get those updated versions out and online. And I think if you're looking for a simple, how do I get going on EC2, the whole ECS orchestration thing, there's no additional cost for that. It's just the resources you're using, like EC2. So if you're already going to be paying for an EC2 instance that you want to put Docker on and run, you could take advantage of ECS and let them facilitate all the orchestration and the rolling releases and the auto scaling and everything if you want as well. So there's a lot of options in that.
That's awesome. It sounds like we can get pretty deep into the rabbit hole with going on to production, and especially yeah, absolutely. And talking about Docker Swarm and all that, I'd like to get deeper, but we're a little getting close to wrap up time, and I have a lot more things I want to talk about. So I want to like fly through these next couple of things. One just being like a misconception that I had about accessing Docker through the CLI, because I'm used to with Vagrant to be able to say Vagrant up and then just SSHing into the Vagrant box that gets loaded up. And so I did some Googling and I figured out a way to SSH into Docker, but finding out later that it's not really SSHing into Docker, but it's accessing, I guess, the TTY. But can you help me understand like what's happening? How do I get access to a Docker's like CLI basically?
So the best way to think about it is Docker isn't a machine; it's a process. Docker spins up a single process and watches it. You can use things like Docker exec to spawn a second process in that little area, and that's actually what happens. So if you do docker exec -ti my web container bash, it actually goes into that area that your web server's running in and spawns a second process called bash, and then you see everything that your process sees. And that's the biggest hang up a lot of people have is containers aren't machines, even though they kind of act like it. They're just processes that live in their own little world. So you can put things in that world too, like a second bash process, and be able to start typing commands. But it's not a full-on machine. So then we need to be able to get in there and do stuff and manipulate the file system. That's usually the biggest thing. And that's where the SSHing part comes in. So you do Docker exec, you get in there and you can start to work with it. Otherwise, there's actually no command line process running inside of that container at any point.
Yeah,
cool.
There's no SSH daemon running unless you start one, which some people have done, but that's a little crazy.
You shouldn't do that.
But again, yeah, exactly. Like I don't necessarily like. There's a lot of dogma around Docker and how to run it properly, and I don't necessarily like the dogma, but I definitely agree that running SSH in a container is a little weird. Like, and if you go changing stuff inside of that container, you're going to lose those changes.
Right.
Because the container, when you restart it, is just going to go off of your base image, and you obviously haven't made that change in the image and to rebuild a new image.
Right. And my main reason for accessing it from the console is that a lot of my web apps actually have a significant console component to them that I need to run commands from. And I don't really like doing the really long Docker command and then appending the command I want to run at the end of that for every single command I want to run, you know? So it's just convenient to be able to the way I think about SSHing into the container, but that's not what it's doing. So I'm accessing the bash, and say I get when I run Docker exec or Docker compose exec or whichever way you're accessing it, by default it just logs you in as root, which makes me feel really gross. And so I figured out a way by Googling a way of like creating a user on the build that has sudo access. So I had to install sudo and then with apt-get, and then I had to like create a user and put them in a group called developers and like do basically what I would do on production basically. And then I even have something in there that makes a pretty little command prompt with a poop emoji in there or something. And then when I log in when I start the container, I specify that I want to start it with a specific user, and not the root user but the sudo user. Does that sound like a reasonable way of approaching that?
No.
It's a way of doing it. It's not a clean way of doing it. It is a way of doing
it doesn't feel clean.
The other thing you have to remember is most containers, especially if you're pulling them off Docker Hub, like the base PHP images and stuff, they expect to run as root. They don't expect another user to necessarily run inside of them, and that can cause problems. Usually what I will do is, getting kind of back to Chris's point of like entry points and commands and stuff, you can kind of abuse those and spin up container or their command services in like Docker Compose. So you can do Docker Compose run --rm unit tests, and it will spin up a container, run your unit tests, and then die. And then I have one for Composer, and I have one for getting into the command line points. So I doing that is the way you're doing it is a way. I don't know that I would recommend it, just because containers expected most of the time run as root, and you can run into weird little issues, permissions issues, especially getting into files.
Well, that brings up a totally different thing that I forgot to even talk about, but there's so many things. Okay, so when I access the TTY, there's one using Docker Compose. I got this big list. I've got one called Web. I've got one called like MySQL that runs the MySQL container. So the Web one I think is a mirror of, it might be the PHP one. I don't know. But I've got several of these things set up. And one thing that kind of struck me when I first started doing this is when I would access the TTY of the Web one, I wasn't able to access the MySQL stuff. Oh, and I was like, oh, so I have to actually access the TTY of the MySQL container. And so I had to go in there and run the MySQL commands from a separate bash, which was a little kind of gotcha I ran into. But another gotcha that kind of related is that in my .env file, I'm used .env. I'm trying to get off of that because it's not using environment variables to store your config. These kind of sensitive things is not a good idea. But I am doing it for some of my projects. And if I were to locally, if I were to specify a .env to access the MySQL container, I had to use the word MySQL or whatever I called it in the
it's the service
Compose.
name, especially in your Docker Compose, and those become DNS entries.
Yep.
All of the containers that there's additional advanced networking stuff you can set up in there if you choose to, but if you don't specify networking stuff, that becomes a service name and it's a DNS routable name.
That's crazy, because so instead of MySQL host pointing to localhost or 127.0.0.1, it just literally says MySQL for the in development, which is kind of crazy.
Thing.
Yeah,
I love it.
And the same thing for Redis or Mailcatcher or anything. I had to specify a specific those as the host name, which is really interesting. But kind of related to the hostname thing, I don't know if we have time to really get into this, but one thing that I like to do with Vagrant is in my Etsy host file locally, I like to set up a .dev TLD basically TLD for whatever project I'm working on. So if the project is foo, it'd be foo.dev, and it would just point to whatever the IP address of the VM was for Vagrant. Now by default, I've just got my Docker stuff running on localhost with ports like 80 bound to 80 and things like that. So I don't have the port 8888, which is kind of like a lot of people use for whatever. But the one thing that what works well is just setting up my Etsy host file to point to localhost for whatever alias I want. But what about setting up subdomains for that? How do you handle subdomains and also TLS? Like if I wanted to like set up a SSL certificate /TLS certificate for something and run it sort of behind a secure connection locally. I know this might be a rabbit hole we don't want to go, but
I'll give my simple answer, and if you guys want to do more fancy setups than I do, then definitely talk about them. I don't bother. I just run localhost, and I just bind to a different port for each app. Localhost port 80, 8080, 8888. I don't necessarily in my day-to-day life don't run multiple apps at the same time. Occasionally I do, and I'll just bind to a different port than 80. So in a workflow I've created is to have a bash script that makes it really easy to run Docker Compose commands. So I just say like, if I call my script develop, which is what I do, I'll just say develop composer install whatever, and it knows to run Docker Compose blah, 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 composer. And in that script, I have some boilerplate that helps me with what we're talking about. What are we talking about? Crap.
Well, he also mentioned TLS.
So I just
locally.
Yeah, exactly. I just that's where I set a different port, and I can use environment variables to say what port to bind to and stuff. TLS, I literally do not bother with I don't bother testing when I'm developing locally with an SSL certificate because I don't care. It just like hasn't been a bug I've ever hit. If we typically have staging environments for work stuff that matters, and that'll have an SSL certificate, so that gets to be testing if it works with an SSL or not. The end. Kiss. Keep it simple.
Done.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. Everything binds to port 8080. I never really run more than one at a time. Now I can cheat, and I have scripts that will actually pull the IP out because I run Linux, so I can just go straight to the container IP and everything magically works. You can't do that on Mac or Windows, which is kind of a bummer. You have to always use the port forwarding, and I'm the same vein. I don't mess with TLS day to day. I will skeleton the stuff up in a little fake Docker machine running in VirtualBox to test bringing up the Let's Encrypt container, which is running Nginx, and then something that's doing all the proxying and all that. But day to day, I just bring up just the web stuff and work with it because SSL nowadays is not going to be the thing that's probably going to give me a bug.
Gotcha. I think the main reason I was setting things up for SSL is or under TLS stuff is because I was interfacing with some OAuth clients or OAuth services that required the redirect to be behind TLS, and so in the config it wouldn't even let me submit like localhost without HTTPS. Right. So I guess that was my main reasoning for doing TLS setup.
I think some people have set up like Nginx or just some kind of proxy. And then you can use like a .dev domain, and then you set up your Nginx or a proxy or whatever configuration to route to your Docker apps, depending on the host name used. And then like your Docker apps can still be bound to different ports or whatever your situation is. If you're on Linux, you can just go right to an IP.
Yeah, I've also used ngrok for that, which will set up that reverse tunnel and give it to you on HTTPS as well. So if you're not familiar with ngrok, that's a fantastic tool for developing stuff locally and letting outside people access it or check it out. So,
and there are a couple Nginx containers that will handle or setups that will do Let's Encrypt with an Nginx proxy, and then they read your Docker setup and magically set up routing virtual hosts. It's kind of a bear to set up just for like day-to-day stuff, but that works pretty well if you need to have SSL. So, like if you just Google Docker Nginx SSL proxy, you'll find something that tells you how to set that up. It's usually like you end up setting up like 2 or 3 extra containers to get it to work though.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, it's about time to start wrapping things up. I do want to just at least touch on 2 little things. Hopefully they're not too crazy. One thing I noticed is that if I set a container up initially with Docker and I tagged it with some sort of name, and then later I set it up, I wanted to actually run it through Docker Compose, and then I specified a different tag name in the .yaml file, it was still using the original tag name that I set up with Docker. And I don't know, I don't even know if that's even what happened, but sometimes I get like a different tag name when I Docker Compose up. Does anybody run into that?
Is it does your tag happen to be the same name as the directory that your project is in? Because it goes by, if Docker Compose will create like in my experience, it's just a directory name for the container name because it has to differentiate and create a different container name for every container it spins up. So I don't know if that works on tags because I don't usually, like when I build an image, I make a tag out of for the image, but I don't usually use the tags flag when I'm just creating containers to classify containers or anything. So I don't know if it's doing tags over the directory name instead.
Gotcha.
Do you guys? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the naming gets kind of screwy. In dev, I don't usually use tags. It's just whatever Docker Compose build, and then I push it up. I let the production thing handle it because I usually specify date names and stuff as like specific tags because I want this thing that I just built to go out. But yeah.
Gotcha.
Are you having problems pulling down public ones with tags or like tagging specific ones you've built?
Yeah, it was just weird. It's happened to me once or twice where I used Docker, just a plain old Docker file, and just use Docker commands on it. But when I convert it over to using Docker Compose.yaml, it's using the old tag that I set up for it instead of the one I specified in the Docker Compose, which is just I don't know. And also with the naming, I found that using underscores is actually better than using hyphens when coming up with the tag name, because it does some auto conversion stuff that you don't kind of expect when you use dashes, I guess. One last thing before we wrap it up. Sometimes will happen to me, and I'm just curious if you've run into this. I'll do Docker Compose up or Docker Compose start or whatever, and everything's running nicely. I usually will do a Docker Compose up in my like in the terminal, and then I'll create, and it won't what do you call it when you run it in the background versus like it just stays open?
Daemonize it.
Daemonize it.
Or,
Yeah, so if I don't daemonize it, it's just kind of like running there. Like I run the command and it stops and it's like waiting. I'll just open up a new tab and then do all the other things I want to do with it. When I go back to that other tab that's still open, and like I like to see my log output for like accessing like access log or whatever that gets output into that that first terminal. To exit, I just press Control C to like close or to stop everything. Sometimes it's like, oh, you want to exit, shutting down gracefully. Other times it just goes abort and then it just exit, but the container's still running. Does anybody run into that and know why that sometimes it works and sometimes it shuts down gracefully, sometimes it just blurks?
Sometimes Docker's
almost-
just dumb.
Yeah.
I would say if you're doing that, there is a Docker logs command. So bring it up normally, and then you can use Docker compose logs and follow it and see all your output. And then you can have the other stuff running in the background without having to worry about the Control C, and it's kind of shut down.
Yep.
Just in case, because Docker doesn't necessarily expect you to shut it down with Control C. So maybe that's just what it is.
I'm wondering if it's like the last container that happens to spun up gets the
Probably,
Control C
yeah.
signal, and the rest don't or something.
Gotcha.
Right?
So how do
Totally.
I run that in the background though? Like if I just wanted to Docker
You
compose up,
just add the -d flag to up.
oh,
Docker compose up -d.
-d.
Yep.
And then when I'm done with it, just Docker compose stop
Down.
or
Yep.
down.
Yeah.
And if you want to get the logs, you can use Docker -compose space logs and either specify a specific container name. If you don't, otherwise it'll give you everything. And then you can do, I think it's -f, I think, will follow it like you're tailing a log, and you can see all the stuff that comes out.
So I could
Other
do
weird trick.
what's
Sorry.
that?
The other weird trick is making sure your processes actually spit stuff out to standard out or standard error, so that you get the stuff in the logs file. Not everything does.
Yes, that's actually a trick I got from you, Fidao. For on your tutorial, you had basically you were outputting instead of pushing to like error log or access log, it would just push to standard out, and that's why I liked running it without it daemonizing it, just so I can see the logs. But if I just run it with a daemonize it, Tankersley, you mentioned the -f. That basically does the same thing. I can just sit there and watch the output for standard out. Is that right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's Docker compose.
Docker compose logs, and I'm pretty sure it's either -f or -- follow, something like that.
And that's just standard out, right?
Yeah,
everything's standard out.
If you want to get really fancy, you can push to like Kibana and like an elk stack.
Oh, geez.
So all your stuff goes and gets logged. But that takes a little bit more.
That's another episode.
That's
God.
That's another production thing. The production cliff of doom.
Oh my gosh, indeed.
It's 3 extra containers. Actually, if you put it in your Docker Compose, it's really easy to do, but
nice.
It's going to take more than half a minute to explain. So, buy my book; it's in there.
All right. Well, this has been a great episode. We're a little bit over time, but I really appreciate all 3 of you for coming on and talking about Docker with me and helping me figure out more stuff. We probably will even have another Docker episode. Who knows? Like in a little while, with even more of the gotchas I've run into. So hopefully, if you're listening and you've been afraid of converting to Docker, hopefully this episode has given you a little bit more incentive to maybe try it out. And at the end, I'll give everybody a promo time to give you some good resources on how to get started with Docker. But since we are wrapping it up, I want to give a big shout out to Chris Shaw, who contributed show notes, which are open source on github.com/PHP Roundtable. And there's a repo there called show-notes where you can contribute the show notes for each episode in Markdown. Chris Shaw submitted one for episode 64, which was PHP 7 source code, a deep dive where me and Sarah just talked about PHP 7 internal stuff. And there's also another Chris. Wow, 2 Chris's on the episode today, and 2 Chris's who submitted the show notes. Christopher Thomas submitted the show notes for episode 30 of SOA and microservices, which was a while ago, which is still wow, it was a long time ago, but we now have show notes for it. Thank you so much, Christopher Thomas and Chris Shaw, for your contribution. And if you'd like to show notes, give you a shout out on the PHP Roundtable Live. There's a couple of CFPs I want to quickly mention. Sunshine PHP CFP ends September 30th, which is a great conference. I won't be able to go this year, unfortunately, because I got a dance thing going on that weekend. PHP Bellinux, their CFP ends October 2nd, so get your paper submitted there. And Midwest PHP, their CFP ends November 20th. So there's still time on all of those to get your paper submitted and hopefully go to those conferences as a speaker. If not a speaker, just go to the conferences because they're fun. Upcoming events, Northeast PHP, we did that earlier, like a month ago, Prince Edward Island. A lot of good times, lots of new friends. Pacific Northwest PHP is coming up September 7th through the 9th. Woohoo! Join me. I'll be talking about the C Spring, under the hood of PHP 7 C Spring, and bringing old legacy apps to PHP 7. But I just want to meet you. So meet me in Seattle, Washington, September 7th. Also, ZenCon is coming up October 23rd through the 26th in Las Vegas. We'll be giving some talks there, some new talks, and would love to meet you there too. So speaking of ZenCon, that's going to bring us to our final thing, which is the developer shout out, which is a segment that recognizes people in the community for doing awesome things. And what we do is send them a $50 Amazon gift card and say thank you for your contribution. And the Amazon gift card is sponsored this time by ZenCon 2017. Join the best and the brightest in PHP in Las Vegas this October. ZenCon.com. Check them out. They're sponsoring the developer shout out with a $50 Amazon gift card. And today I asked the panel, who should we nominate for the developer shout out? And they said Ed Finkler, the OSMI guy. Chris, why do we nominate Ed as the developer shout out for today?
You just said it, man. OSMI guy. It's important.
Open sourcing mental illness, and Phil's got a sticker there to show off there. Awesome. Well, yes, Ed, thank you so much for your hard work on OSMI. Very important organization that has come up on the podcast, actually, in our live episode with PHP Tech. We talked about it a little bit. And they've got a podcast and everything. They do a lot of great work. So, Ed Finkler, I will reach out to you to get your shipping address and send you a PHP Roundtable sticker, probably one of the big ones. I got like 2 of the really big ones left, and then I'll have nothing but the small ones. Thanks again to ZenCon for sponsoring the $50 Amazon gift card. And I think that's about it. We're going to wrap up with some shameless promotional things. Mr. Fidao, you got anything you would like to promote?
Sure do. You can find my stuff free and paid at serversforhackers.com, including my shipping Docker course. There's links to it on serversforhackers.com. Also on that site is a section on containers, and it has like a getting started with Docker section. And another little mini course is free I have on there that's all about developing a workflow that we talked about, which uses Docker Compose and all that stuff, and has a really helpful bash script on top of it that helps you do stuff like run commands really easily, so you don't have to remember Docker Compose commands. Yeah,
because you used to be the Vapro bash guy, right?
I do. I have that repository. I get PRs that I ignore monthly, I guess.
Nice. So you still got bash script helping you out for things. That's great.
Bash script hell, yeah.
Yeah. All right, Tankersley, you got anything you want to promote?
Yeah, so I've got the Docker for Developers book. We just redid it for all the new Docker CE stuff. So that's available now. If you go to learningcontainers.com, I've got links to the LeanPub version, the video version, and then the print version is also out now through PHP Architect. That became available last week, I think, or the week before. So if you're interested in getting the book, or I'm slowly building the blog site up of it now that I've got a good site for it. But go to learningcontainers.com. You can find ways to purchase the book and all of that and all that good stuff.
Awesome. It recently updated, right? Recently updated. I saw that on Twitter.
Yeah, the LeanPub version got updated about a month ago, and the paper version about 2 weeks ago.
So you get to buy it again if you already bought it, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. How about you, Phil?
If you have the LeanPub, it will get free lifetime updates.
Oh, beautiful.
I will
nice.
say that. Yeah.
So even more incentive to get it.
Yes.
Mr. Phillip, do you have anything you want to promote?
Sure. Last time I think I promoted the same thing, but I'll cover it again because we're talking Docker, is the ECS deploy script that we wrote to simplify how we do our rolling releases out to Amazon. So if you just Google ECS-deploy, it's the #1 result there. It's our GitHub repo. It's got a lot of activity and people using it, so it's pretty cool. And on that same search results page, like maybe number 6 or 8 or something like that, is an article I wrote on the CodeShip blog about that script and the process it uses and stuff. So if you want to learn what it's doing, check that out. And then one final one, I wrote an art for the easiest way to get going with Docker on Amazon is using Terraform. And so I've written an article on terraforming your Docker environment on Amazon, scheduled to be published first week of October, also on the CodeShip blog at turned into a mini book. So it's going to be broken into at least 3 parts for consumability. But I'll tweet about that in a month or so.
Excellent.
So, yes.
Well, if you would like to join us in a future episode, our next one will probably be on concurrency and parallelism, which is kind of fun. I haven't settled a date on that yet, but we'll get to you probably for the next episode. Then we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome in another episode, which I already sat together with some really cool new friends at Pacific Northwest PHP. I'm sorry, at Northeast PHP earlier this month, which I already mentioned. We already have some good notes on imposter syndrome, and it should be a fun episode. If you have anything that you'd like to share on the PHP Roundtable, just hit me up. I'm Sammy K on Twitter, or ping PHP Roundtable, or go to phproundtable.com, fill out the form, and be like, let's talk about this. I love getting those kinds of requests because it keeps the topics flowing. That wraps us up with this episode pretty much, and I'm really happy because I have to pee really, really badly. So thanks so much for Chris Fidao, Chris Tankersley, and Phillip Shipley for joining us, and we'll see you folks in the next episode.
Peace.
Bye.